Hello there, my name is Robin. Welcome to the channel. Welcome to Only the Best Fantasy Novels. Today I wanted to take the time to talk about 10 of my favorite standalone fantasy novels. These tend to be a rare thing in fantasy. Most authors write duologies, trilogies, um, at minimum, but there are some really great standalone fantasy novels out there, um, and these are 10 picks from me. Without further ado, in no particular order, I have number one, Dale Bailey's In the Nightwood. So this is a book I came across whilst I was reading my way through the World Fantasy Award nominees. I believe this was one from 2019, and it's a really haunting, really eldritch story of a grieving author who moves from America to England following the death of his daughter to live in the house of the fantasy author that he's writing a biography for. And whilst there, the story just gets darker and more atmospheric, and he becomes subsumed by the same madness, the same supernatural stuff that captivated the author that he was trying to create a biography for. I don't want to get too much more into it, but needless to say, it was a pretty epic book. Definitely worth checking out, especially if you're a fantasy reader that's a little more into like the horror fairy tale side of things. And speaking of fairy tales, that brings me to number two, which I'm sure many of you won't be surprised to see on here, and that is Susanna Clarke's Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell. This is, with no argument, one of my favorite books of all time. Do I even need to introduce this? Come to think of it, it's an absolutely... In case I do need to introduce it, I'll just go ahead. It's an absolutely epic story about the return of magic to England, and it's magic that flows through two schools of thought. The first is we have the more stodgy, the more stodgy academic Mr. Norrell, who uses his magic following a structure, a framework, that kind of idea. And then there's the Jonathan Strange, who embodies a wilder, more primeval form of magic. And the story is about their exploits, and it just gets wild from there, to say the least. Absolutely one of the best fantasy books written of all time. Definitely one of the best standalone ones written of all time. If you haven't read this as yet, you really and truly need to. I promise it'll be worth the wait. Number three is a book I've mentioned on the channel in the past, and that is John Crowley's Ka. This is another World Fantasy Award nominee I came across, and this is a story of Dar Oakley, who is a crow who stumbled across the power of resurrection, and he's lived millennia as a result. Every time he dies, he comes back. He's lived millennia, and he's seen the rise of humanity from primeval times to modern day. He's actually traveled across to the Americas, and it's a really fascinating tale because it's communicated in the form of a conversation between him and a man who learns to speak the language of crows. And we get Dar Oakley's proverbial bird's eye view on the evolution of humanity from wandering tribes, campfire prime cavemen basically, onto modern society, and what he thinks as an outsider looking in. It's an amazing book. It takes a special book to really pull off having a crow as your main character, but so worth the read. I promise it'll be an interesting treat. if you decide to check it out. Number 4 is another book I'm sure many of you wouldn't be surprised to see on here, and that is Neil Gaiman's American Gods. Neil Gaiman is one of my favorite authors, and this book is a book that probably broke fantasy for me. It really expanded my horizons of what fantasy novels can do, because back when I read it, I was mainly reading epic fantasy, and I didn't know stories this wild, this creative, this innovative could even be written. But Neil Gaiman pulls it off. He takes a good hard look at humanity, at what we focus and what we worship in this modern day society, and he pulls no punches. And as a British guy, he really doesn't pull punches when it comes to North America. Let's put it like that. But yeah, moving on is probably a strange pick for this list, but it makes so much more sense after you read it, and that is Gabriel Garcia Marquez's 100 Years of Solitude. It's more on the literary, magical realist side of fantasy, but it's a very, very fascinating novel. It's a very insane one. It documents the history of a family over 100 years. Their triumphs, their tragedies of a South American family, far more, because Gabriel Garcia Marquez is Colombian, and I'm from South America, so this made a must. This was at one point a must read for me, but I didn't expect to enjoy it on the level that I did. And it's crazy. It's rich. It's lyrical. It's intense, and most of all, it's unusual. It'll make for a strange and captivating read, to say the least. Definitely worth checking out. Number 6 is a book that completely blew me out of the water, and that is Frances Hardinge's Deep Light. The fact that she isn't more widely read in my books is criminal, because she writes some amazing stuff. And Deep Light is... I went into Deep Light because it had like an interesting blurb, and I was completely and utterly blown away by it. This is a quote-unquote middle grade young adult book. But it just goes to show how unfortunate the fact that marketing tends to try to pigeonhole books in age groups and genres can cause things to slip through the crack, because this is an absolutely amazing book. It follows the story of two deep sea divers who scavenge and salvage for a living, and it's a Lovecraftian story. So whilst diving, something begins to call to them, and you can imagine how things unfold from there. It's rich. It's absolutely beautiful. I'm a very imaginative person in terms of, like, when I read something, I like to imagine what it looks like, picture it, and this book was just rich and lush in the descriptions and the scenery that it evokes. It's absolutely 100% a must read for me if you want to check out standalone fantasy novels. I promise it'll blow you away. That's number 6. Moving on, we have number 7, and that is Alex E. Harrow's The Once and Future Witches. This is the book that made me a diehard Alex E. Harrow fan. That made it so that if she publishes a grocery list, I'll read it. It's set shortly after, a few centuries after the Salem witch trials, and it follows a family of sisters who are suffragists, and in their bid to achieve more power, to achieve more freedom, they begin to learn the old ways, the witchy ways, and it really unfolds in an amazing, a spectacular way. It's an absolutely entrancing book, 100% worth the read. It's at the pinnacle for me of the recent surge in books featuring witches, and absolutely, absolutely wonderful. Moving on is actually one of my favorite books of 2023, and that is Guy Gavriel Kay's The Lions of Alersand. Um, this is my favorite book that I've ever read from him by far, and it's, for me, the reason why I recommend this and not Tigana, which I also enjoyed, is because this is shorter. This is everything we love about Guy Gavriel Kay in one really great book. It's rich, evocative, very high highs, dark lows, amazing characters, absolutely spectacular situations, and the dialogue, and it, it's amazing. It's a really amazing book. It covers the it's a fantastical version of the Iberian Peninsula War between the Moors and the Spanish, and we get a cast of characters that are unforgettable. Um, Absolutely lovely book. Absolutely hilarious, engaging. And at the end of it, like, I just sat and I couldn't believe it was over. I'm definitely going to have to reread it very soon, just to marinate in it all over again. Um, but to keep things moving along, I have at number 9 I have R.F. Kuang's Babel. This was one of my favorite books of the year when it was released, and I consider it absolutely essential to read. Um, it's a very hard, unflinching look at colonialism. She pulls no punches in the way it absolutely exploits. It absolutely exploited the victim nations, and in addition to that, she also has some very fascinating things to say about translation. She makes you really think about how the act of translation is one of destruction, and I don't want to get too much farther into it and like basically spoil the one of the major themes of the book, but this is very much a discussion on translation, and ultimately the story is one of rebellion, because when your culture gets destroyed, no person is going to take that lightly. But moving on, I had to finish this list with probably my single most favorite fantasy book of all time. Um, it is the most underrated. Um, it's the most underrated fantasy of all time in my books. It's criminally underread, and that is Hope Mirrlees' Blood in the Mist. Um, this is an absolutely spellbinding fairy tale about a father who starts to delve into the forbidden mysteries of fairy and fairy lore after his son. It's suspected that his son ate fairy fruit, and he becomes desperate to try to save him and to save his town. Um, like I said, this is the single most underrated fantasy novel of all time, and the fact that it's very common to see lists of underrated fantasies and this book isn't even mentioned is a testament to how terribly underrated it is, because it should definitely be on those lists, on any list of of underrated fantasy novels. It's wild. It's absolutely beautiful. It's very lyrical. Hope Mirrlees is one of those rare authors where she's not she wasn't prolific. She clearly prioritized quality over quantity. Blood and Mist is one of the best books ever written in the fantasy genre, in my opinion. You should absolutely look into this. If you check out no other book on this list, check out Blood and Mist. I promise you're in for a treat. And that's it for my list of 10 standalone fantasy novels to check out. As I was putting together this list, I realized I have quite a lot more than 10. So I'm probably going to make a part 2 to this video at some point in the future. I don't know when, but you can be on the lookout for that. Until such time, if you made it to this point of the video, thank you very much for watching, and yeah, keep it cool.